So Chris Vanini at The Athletic writes a Sunday column titled Making the Case for Stanford and Cal to join the ACC. For context purposes, in the aftermath of the Pac-12 breaking apart and schools leaving for the Big 12 and the Big 10, you've got some stragglers. Washington State, Oregon State, you got Stanford and Cal. Stanford and Cal, there's been a push to get them to join the ACC. You've had Condoleezza Rice, Stanford grad, publicly stumping for Stanford. Who was stumping for Cal? No, it was George Bush.
Bush for SMU.
Yeah, the dub was pushing for SMU, although the SMU conversation seems to have withered on the vine. And I think it was Brett McMurphy who said maybe the ACC will listen to Cal if Marshawn Lynch decides to publicly stump for Cal. There was a vote against from Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, and NC State. And there's been a lot of digital link and a lot of YouTube space devoted to, well, why would they do this? And we talked about this a little bit last week. Ultimately, you can come up with all sorts of reasons as to why they shouldn't do it. But there is one common denominator. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add
the right word.
Money.
Doesn't make financial sense.
It doesn't. Stanford and Cal are not helping the ACC in terms of television revenue. If anything, it eats into your budgets because you have to account for travel to get out to the West Coast. And Vanini pushes against this. So I read it. And his ultimate argument was the ACC should add Stanford and Cal because everybody else is doing it. Are you a parent, Chris?
You should drink that brass monkey at the Jersey
everybody
Shore
else is
because
doing
all
it.
of your friends are.
Like I mean, I don't know Chris. I don't know
Chris either. And I'll be fully transparent here. I retweeted his story, but I didn't read it.
I read it
because it's absurd.
I'll read it and I'll get to it in a second. But ultimately, the story is multiple paragraphs about how everybody else did it, so you should too. Which again speaks to the fact that I don't think Chris is a parent, because if you were a parent, how many times have you said, "Oh, because such and such is doing it, you feel like you need to do it"?
Is Giglio jumping off the bridge too?
Oh, are you going to do it too?
Go ahead.
Oh, Giglio's going to the Jersey Shore and drinking a bunch of brass monkey. How'd that work out for him?
Not good.
Not great,
Here
right?
we are.
And here we
31 years later, I'm struggling.
But one thing, it gets back to our conversation about Roy Cooper, and where I understand some listeners would be upset with Roy Cooper and consistency.
Sure. And
there is a nasty habit when we talk about the ACC and adding teams and people ultimately undercutting their arguments without realizing it. So Vanini spends multiple paragraphs arguing that Stanford and Cal should be in the ACC because, well, they have successful athletic departments. And academically, well, Stanford does. Academically, they're in line with the majority of the ACC.
Absolutely.
Cool. Then he writes this. The Big 12 survived and has thrived because it has it. Vibes, man. Vibes. Thrived because it gathered like-minded schools that know they can't catch the Big 10 and SEC in revenue. The rest of the ACC needs to understand that third place is not a bad place to be. It's even possible that the league's supposed albatross of a TV deal through 2036 actually looks good in 5 years with the state of the TV industry. Having a linear channel with the ACC network and longer guarantees from ESPN is not necessarily a bad thing.
Wait, is he arguing for us or for him? What does he think he's arguing for right now?
Chris, dude, do you understand what you just did in that paragraph? Do you understand what you just did in that paragraph? You essentially negated every argument for additions to the ACC outside of Notre Dame. If you bring Notre Dame and Stanford as their buddy, then yes, we can have this conversation. But it starts and ends with what Notre Dame does, which is a separate podcast altogether. But that paragraph right there from Chris is not unique to him. There's a lot of people who talk themselves in the circles about all these fantasy scenarios about conference realignment, games of risk, which is essentially what this is. And they're like, you should do this and you should do that. Shout out to Greg Swaim, who has made a career for nearly 20 years talking about conference realignment and being wrong 99% of the time. But hey, cool, man. You get millions of views coming up with fantasy scenarios because that's ultimately what listeners want to engage with. But in the real world, what you just argued, what you just said in that paragraph is the reason why the ACC shouldn't do anything. It's the golden handcuffs. It's the gift and the curse of the grant of rights. Essentially, what you're saying here is something you can't even commit to. that being in third place isn't a bad thing. Joe, how
That's where
many
the ACC
years
is right now?
How many years have I been arguing that third place is not a bad place to be?
It's just fine.
It's just fine. You're not built like the Big Ten. You're not built like the SEC.
The Big Ten, by the way, which never wins. All kinds of money.
And you have a place at the table, which is the most important thing. And everything else should revolve around the fact that you have a place at the table. That's what drives Clemson. And ultimately what should drive Florida State.
Yeah, let's be clear here. If Stanford and Cal made financial sense, the presidents, who are ultimately the ones making this decision, would have already made the decision.
Yeah.
That they would add Stanford and Cal. So I'm assuming Chris's argument was, you put TV time slots. You could have a time slot late night and you can watch the ACC football all day, which was Colin Cowherd's cockamamie Big Ten argument, right? If those schools added value, they would already be in the ACC. If Oregon and Washington, going back a step, added any value, they'd already be in the ACC as a full member. Okay? Sometimes you just have to say the stuff out loud. NC State ran a fake field goal against ECU in 2016, where the holder, who is the punter, by the way, ran the option with the kicker. And I would just say to you in the meeting room, just say it aloud. Hey, man, we're going to run a fake where the punter runs the option to the kicker. And at some point, somebody in that room would say to Dave Doran, hey, coach, that's not a good idea. So I think what NC State and what North Carolina are doing right now, I think what Kevin Guskowitz and Randy Woodson are doing right now is they're having Notre Dame and Boston College and Wake Forest and any other school that thinks adding Stanford and Cal is a good idea. They're just saying to them, hey, just say it out loud. Let's walk through it.
Yeah.
You want to add a football program in Stanford, right? Because this is about football. This isn't about all of the other sports that they excel in. This is about football. Here's Stanford. Stanford had a run under Jim Harbaugh and David Shaw, no doubt. Here's their last 4 years: 3-9, 3-9, 4-2 in the pandemic, 4-8. That's why Shaw got fired. Here's the ultimate argument against Stanford football. Bill Walsh is considered the father of modern football. Bill Walsh is the true genius of coaching. Forget Bill Belichick if you're too young to remember. Okay. Bill Walsh actually came back at the end of his career and coached 3 years at Stanford. Yes, he went 10-3 one year. Then he went 4-7, 3-7-1, and he tapped out and said, I got enough of this.
Yeah.
If the greatest coach in the history of this game, in the modern game, can't win at your school, guess what? You probably got some problems. Okay. Now let's talk about Cal. Do you realize the last time, and here comes the shattering glass, because Carolina hasn't won this thing since 80. State hasn't won this thing since 79. Do you realize the last time Cal solely won the Pac-8 title? It was called the Pac-8 back then.
Yeah.
So there's your first hint.
Yeah.
1950.
Jeez.
They had a guy named Aaron Rodgers who just might be the single most talented quarterback in the history of the NFL, by the way. They had him for 2 years, and they did really well with him. They didn't actually win the conference that year because USC beat them. USC had to vacate it. 1950 is Cal's last outright Pac conference title. Do you want to guess who the coach was?
I have no idea.
You might guess it as a Mad Lib. Let's fill in some answers. Your first name is a liquor. Your last name is a hotel. Pappy Waldorf was their coach in 1950.
I put some Pappy Waldorf in a cookout shake,
and people got mad.
Yes.
So again, all you got to do is say these things aloud in the room or on the conference call with the other presidents and say, what do we really get in Stanford and Cal?
You get nothing.
You could probably look really cool in the U.S. News and World Report or the Princeton Review. Yes. But guess who's not buying TV subscriptions for whatever they are in 2023? Guess who's not buying tickets to go to a stadium to see the Princeton Review or read the U.S. News and World Report rankings?
Yeah.
All of those people, those fans in the Big Ten, those fans in the SEC.